The smoke found her before the sound did. Clemency woke with it already in her throat, thick and sweet and wrong, the smell of old varnish and horsehair turning to poison. For one breath, she thought she had left a candle burning. Then the window went orange, and the orange moved, and she understood that the light was not hers. Across the black courtyard of Ravenscar Hall, the east wing was breathing fire out of every casement, and the frost on her own glass had begun to weep. She did not scream. She had learned, in 3 years under that roof, that screaming brought her nothing. She pulled on the wrapper folded at the foot of her bed, pushed her bare feet into cold slippers, and went out into the corridor where the stone was already warm. Somewhere below, a bell began to jangle. The fire bell, rung too late by a footman who had smelled it in his sleep. Doors banged. A woman's voice rose and broke. And through it all, Clemency heard one thing that turned her, as surely as a hand on her shoulder, toward the burning wing. The Dowager Duchess slept there. Honora, the old Duke's widow, who had not spoken a kind word to her since the day she came. Honora, whose rooms were at the far end of the East Range, past the long gallery, in the very heart of the flame. No one was going for her. They were in the courtyard now, the whole waking household, footmen in their shirts and maids clutching each other. The butler, Mr. Odell, in his nightcap, counting heads and finding one short. Clemency saw Rosamond Vane among them, wrapped in a shawl the color of dove feathers, her fair hair loose and lovely even now. And she saw Rosamond look toward the east wing and hesitate and not move. "Her Grace," someone said. "The Dowager. She's not out." "The gallery's alight," said Mr. Odell hoarsely. "No man can pass it." They stood there, all of them, and did nothing, because there was nothing a sensible person could do. The heat came off the stones like an open oven. To go in was to choose to burn. Clemency looked at her own hands in the firelight. Plain hands, strong hands. Ink still ghosted the side of her right finger where she had been going over the linen accounts that evening because no one else at Ravenscar would trouble themselves to do it. The Dowager called them counting-house hands, when she deigned to notice them at all. Trade hands, not a lady's. She had said it as though it were the worst thing a pair of hands could be. Clemency wrapped the sopping hem of her wrapper across her mouth, took a breath of the last clean air she was likely to get, and went in. The gallery was a tunnel of fire. She kept low, the way her father's warehouse men had taught her to move in smoke when she was a girl in Newcastle. Stay under it, the good air lies along the floor. And she went along the wall with her burning eyes shut to slits, counting doors by touch. 3, 4, the paint blistered under her palm. Something overhead gave a long groan, like a great beast turning in its sleep, and a burning curtain fell across the passage behind her and closed it. There would be no going back the way she came. She found the Dowager's door by the brass of its handle, which seared her hand so that she cried out for the first time. Inside, the old woman lay tangled in her bedclothes, not asleep but frozen, her long gray hair down, her eyes enormous. Honora, Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar, who had ruled that house for 40 years, lay helpless as a child and stared at the last person in England she wanted to see. "You," she said. "Me," said Clemency. "There's no one else. Can you stand?" She could not. The old woman's legs had failed her years ago in the cold. She moved through her days on 2 canes and the arms of servants, and the servants were in the courtyard, and the gallery was gone. Clemency did the only sum the night left her. She stripped the wet coverlet, wrapped it around the old woman's head and shoulders, bent and lifted her. Honora weighed almost nothing, a bundle of dry sticks and pride. And yet, she was the heaviest thing Clemency had ever carried, because there was only one way out now. Through the servant's stair at the wing's black end, and every step of it was uphill into worse. The trade hands held. They did not shake. They gripped the old woman's frail body and would not let it fall. Past the burning gallery mouth, up the narrow turning stair where the smoke lay so thick that Clemency navigated by the count of her own feet, and nothing else. Out at last through a low door onto the frozen kitchen court, into air so cold after the furnace that it felt like being struck. She fell to her knees on the frost and laid the dowager down upon the icy cobbles as gently as she could, and knelt over her, coughing black, and could not for a long moment see or speak or think. When her sight came back, the whole household was running toward them across the court, Mr. Odell, the maids, Rosamond with her dove-gray shawl. And every eye went straight to the old woman on the ground. Not one of them looked at the woman kneeling beside her, whose hands had begun, in the freezing dark, to blister and split. And the Duke was not there at all. To understand that night, you must go back 3 years, to a colder bargain than the fire. Clemency Fenn had not been born to castles. She was born above a counting house in Newcastle, over the noise of the quayside, the only child of Josiah Fenn, who insured ships and warehouses and other men's whole lives against the sea and the flame. Her mother died when she was small. Her father raised her among his ledgers because he had nowhere else to put her, and found, to his surprise, that she had a head for it, for risk, for figures, for the cold art of putting a price on things that could be lost. A man only learns the worth of what he owns on the night it burns, Josiah used to say, closing a policy over some merchant's warehouse. That's why he pays me before it does. He said it so often that Clemency stopped hearing it as words and heard it only as her father. The way you stop hearing a clock you have lived beside all your life. She was 21 and content among her ledgers when the Duke of Ravenscar's man of business came down the coast to Newcastle with a proposal dressed as an honor. The Ravenscar dukedom was old and grand and drowning. The late Duke, the one who had gambled at cards by candlelight until dawn while his tenants went hungry, had mortgaged the coal seams, the timber, the very roof, and left his son a great cold pile of stone and a mountain of debt. Land could not save it. Only money could, and there was no money in the North Sea wind. There was money on the Newcastle quayside, in the hands of men like Josiah Fenn. So the terms were plain, and everyone at that table understood them, and only Clemency's father was rude enough to say them aloud. The Duke of Ravenscar wanted a fortune. Josiah Fenn wanted his daughter to be a duchess. His grandchildren would carry a ducal name into rooms that would have thrown their grandfather out the servant's door. It was a purchase on both sides, and both sides knew the price. But Josiah Fenn had insured warehouses for 30 years, and an underwriter does not hand over a fortune without a policy. The girl brings £60,000, he told the Duke's attorney, in the dry voice he used for men who thought themselves cleverer than they were. And every farthing of it goes into settlement, tied up in trust for her separate use, with my own trustees holding the strings. Your Duke may have the use of it to keep his roof on. He may not touch the stone of it. And if he ever casts her off, the old man's eyes were flint. He casts off the money with her, and the roof comes down. Put your name to that, sir, or take your ancient name back up the road to your ancient ruin. Clemency sat very still and listened to her father sell her and love her in the same breath. She could have refused. She told herself in the years after that she could have refused. But she was 1 in 20, and the walls of the counting house were close, and somewhere inside her was a foolish, romantic hope that a great cold house might one day grow warm, that a proud man might, in time, come to see her. She signed, and the black japanned deed box that held the settlement, the trust, and her father's own hand upon the page went into her trunk and traveled north with her to Ravenscar, where the wind came off the sea like a slap, and the great front door opened on a hall so cold she could see her own breath. She was 3 years married before she understood what her father had truly given her. Not a title. A door, one she could walk out of on her own terms, whenever the cost of staying grew higher than the cost of loss. She just had not yet learned how to count that cost. The Duke of Ravenscar was not a cruel man. Cruelty would have been easier to bear. Aldous was tall and silent and always somewhere else, even in the room. He had his father's dark eyes and none of his father's warmth, having spent his youth watching that warmth ruin them all. He rose before Clemency, rode out to the flooded pit heads, where the great pumping engines beat day and night to keep the coal seams dry, and came home after dark smelling of horse and coal smoke, and spoke to her across the dinner table as he might to a bailiff, of drains, of debts, of the price of coal at the Newcastle studs. He did not touch her. He did not insult her. He simply did not see her. And there is a particular cold in being unseen by the one person whose seeing would mean everything. The Dowager saw her. The Dowager saw everything. Honora had come to Ravenscar as a bride herself, 40 years before, and had watched her own husband gamble away the family's dignity crown by crown, and had learned to survive the only way a woman of her time could, by making herself harder than the stone. Rank was all she had left, and here was Rank's opposite sitting at her table. A merchant's daughter with ink on her fingers, bought to pay her dead husband's debts. Clemency was the measure of how far the great house of Ravenscar had fallen, and the old woman could not look at her without seeing the fall. "Do not do that here," Honora said one morning early, finding Clemency at the writing desk in the small parlor with the household books open before her, a candle stub and a pen and a column of figures growing under her hand. It was beeswax the family burned in the good rooms. Clemency had noticed that first week, the honeyed smell of it, so unlike the reeking tallow her father's clerks had scratched by. Even the light at Ravenscar announced its rank. Ledgers, sums, put it away. The kitchen accounts were 3 months in arrears, Your Grace. Clemency said the butcher had stopped delivering. Then let a clerk do it, or let us starve like Christians. The old woman came closer and looked down at the ink on the side of Clemency's finger, and her thin mouth curled. "Trade hands," she said softly, almost to herself. "My son married a pair of trade hands." She turned and went, tapping away on her canes, leaving the words behind her in the cold air like a smell. Clemency looked at her own hand, at the ink. She did not put the ledger away. She finished the column because the butcher would not deliver on wounded feelings, and because she had discovered a truth her father would have approved of. At Ravenscar, whatever her name, whatever the Dowager thought of her hands, she was the only one who could read a bill. That evening she did what she always did when the house grew too cold to bear. She went up to her room and knelt at her trunk and lifted the black Japan deed box out into the candlelight. Inside lay the settlement, folded in red tape, and beneath it a single letter in her father's cramped underwriter's hand. He had written it the week before he died, the second year of her marriage, and she had read it so many times the folds were soft as cloth. Value is measured at the moment of loss, he had written. Remember what you are worth, girl, even where they will not name it. The box is yours. The door in it is yours. Do not sit in a burning house because you are ashamed to be seen leaving it. She had thought it only a father's grief then, a dying man's fear for a daughter far away. She did not yet know he had written her a prophecy. She closed the box and blew out the candle and lay in the dark listening to the sea, and did not weep, because at Ravenscar tears were only one more thing they could take from her. There was one person at Ravenscar the Dowager loved, and it was not her son. Rosamond Vane was Aldous' second cousin, orphaned young, portionless, taken in by Honora as a girl of 10, and raised at Ravenscar as a poor relation, which is to say raised to be grateful and to fear the day the gratitude ran out. She was clever, and she was kind in the way of people who have learned that kindness is a currency. And she was beautiful with the particular soft beauty the age most prized. And she had grown up certain, with the whole weight of Honora's approval behind her, that one day she would be Duchess of Ravenscar. Then the debts came due, and Aldous married £60,000 instead. And Rosamond smiled through the wedding and never forgave it. Clemency did not hate her. She understood her too well to hate her. She saw what it was to be the poor girl in the rich house, to spend a life saying thank you for the bed you sleep in, to watch the thing you were promised handed to a stranger for money. Rosamond's wound was real. It made her dangerous, and it made her, in her own eyes, only just. Rosamond had taken to running the household, gently, sweetly, positioning herself as the old family's true daughter, while the merchant's girl scratched at her sums. She dismissed servants Clemency had hired. She ordered the menus. She soothed the dowager and warmed the Duke's evenings with music, while Clemency sat unseen with the account books, and slowly, cleverly, she made herself indispensable and made Clemency an inconvenience in her own house. And in the autumn before the fire, Rosamond did a small, careful, thrifty thing to prove herself the better manager of a poor estate. Old Corbett the sweep came up from the village, as he did each year before the winter fires were lit, with his brushes and his soot-black climbing boy. And he went through the east wing and came down gray-faced. The flues in the old range were foul, he said. The dowager's chimney worst of all, a great matted fall of soot and a jackdaw's nest packed hard in the bend, and the mortar gone soft behind the breast where the heat had been eating it for years. It wanted taking down and rebuilding, that stack. It wanted doing before her ladyship lit a fire in that grate again. It would cost, he said. It would cost dear. Rosamond was in the hall when he said it, and Rosamond did the sum a poor girl learns young. A mason and a rebuilt stack would cost £20. A jar of soot swept out would cost a shilling. The dowager felt the cold badly. She must have her fire, and there was no £20 to spare that anyone need know about. Sweep it and be done, Rosamond told him, pressing his shilling into his soot-black hand with a lovely, decided smile. We can none of us be tearing down chimneys on a rumor. Her Grace will have her fire this winter. I'll answer for it. I'll answer for it. Clemency heard the words in passing and thought nothing of them. Old Corbett looked at the shilling, and looked at the fair young lady, and knew better than to argue with quality. He swept the flue. He said his piece to the boy on the road home, that Stack will come to grief. And he went back down to the village. And the winter came on, and in the dowager's grate at the black end of the east wing, night after night, a fire was lit beneath a chimney whose mortar was going to powder. That was the fire that took the east wing at midnight. Not lightning, not fate. A shilling saved by a frightened, clever girl who wanted, more than anything in the world, to be seen at last as the true lady of the house. They laid the dowager in the steward's parlor, because it was the nearest warm room, and they sent a rider through the frozen dark for the surgeon. And no one thought of clemency at all, until Tabitha, her own little maid, pushed through the crowd and saw her mistress's hands. Oh, ma'am. Then Clemency looked down and understood what the cold had been hiding. The palms of both her hands and the inner faces of her fingers were burned. The right worse than the left, where the brass door handle had seared her, the skin white and slack in places and weeping in others, and beginning, now that the numbing shock wore off, to sing with a pain so pure and total that the courtyard swam. Mr. Sowerby, the surgeon, came at last, snow on his shoulders, and he went first to the dowager, as rank required, and found her frightened and smoke-sick but whole. Saved, every servant told him, saved by her grace the young Duchess, who had carried her out through the fire on her own 2 arms. He looked then at those 2 arms, and his face changed. And he crossed the room to Clemency and turned her ruined hands over in the candlelight with the tenderness of a man who has seen what fire does. "These wants dressing tonight," he said, "or you'll lose the use of them." He sent Tabitha running for linseed oil and lime water, and mixed them before their eyes into the pale, milky salve the North knew well. Carron oil, they called it, named for the great ironworks down at Carron, where the furnace men had first found that it eased a burn. He soaked long strips of linen in it and wound them round and round her hands until she wore 2 soft white gloves of pain. And he gave her laudanum in a little wine and told her plainly that she might never again close her right hand as she once had. "You put your hands in the fire, your grace," he said, not unkindly. "The fire keeps something for that." She heard him through the drug's gray fog. Something for that. Trade hands. The hands the dowager despised. She had spent them to carry the old woman out, and now she would wear the cost of it for the rest of her life, written on her palms where anyone could read it. The small shape of that cost took weeks to learn. Tabitha had to dress her now, had to work the hooks of her gowns, the clasp at her throat, and the row of little buttons at each wrist that Clemency's stiffened right hand could no longer manage. The hands that had carried a duchess out of a burning house could not fasten a cuff. There was a grim joke buried in it somewhere, and she was too tired most days to dig it out and laugh. Across the room, propped in the steward's chair with a blanket to her chin, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar watched them bind the young woman's hands, and said nothing, and did not look away. 3 days the east wing smoldered. 3 days the whole coast smelled of it. Wet char and scorched stone, and faintly the Swedish reek of the varnish and the old tapestries, and 40 years of a family's things turned to ash. The great gallery was gone. The dowager's rooms were gone. A third of Ravenscar Hall stood open to the winter sky, its black beams like the ribs of a wrecked ship, gulls turning in the smoke above it. And when the stones at last grew cool enough to walk among, Clemency did the thing her father's warehouse men had always done after a fire, the thing that came to her as plainly as breathing. She went to find out how it had begun. You cannot price a loss, her father used to say, until you know its cause. So while the household made a saint of her, she sent quietly down to the village for old Corbett the sweep, and she asked him about the chimney, and she listened to what he told her, and she said nothing at all. She folded the knowledge away with the settlement in the black japanned box, and carried it, like the box, in silence. It was not yet a thing she meant to use. It was only a thing she meant to know. And on the fourth day, cold and travel-worn and gray with dread, the Duke of Ravenscar came home to find a third of his house burned down, his mother alive, and his wife sitting by the fire with both her hands bound in linen, and the whole household telling one story, and only one, in every corridor and kitchen and stall. The young Duchess carried her grace out herself, through the flames, on her own 2 arms. Aldous stood in his ruined hall and heard it, and for the first time in 3 years of marriage, he could not think what to say to his wife. He came to her that night, which he had never done. Clemency was at the window of the small parlor, watching the sea, her bound hands useless in her lap. She heard the door and knew his step and did not turn. She had waited 3 years for the Duke of Ravenscar to come and find her of his own will, and now that he had, she found she had nothing left over to feel about it. "They tell me," he said, and stopped. He was not a man who spoke of feeling. He had no practice at it, like a man asked to write with his wrong hand. "They tell me you carried my mother out. There was no one else to do it. There were 20 servants in that courtyard." "There were," Clemency agreed, "and not one of them owed her anything but wages. So they did the sensible thing, and stayed alive." She turned from the window at last, and let him see her hands. "I am not sensible about some things. My father was the same." Aldous looked at the linen gloves, and at the wine glass she could not lift, and at the small handbell Tabitha had set beside her because her mistress could no longer pull a bell rope. He saw, too, and looked quickly away from. The buttons at her wrists, done by another hand now, because her own no longer could. The plainest possible measure of what she had spent. She watched the arithmetic of it move across his face. The woman he had bought and ignored had run into a fire that grown men would not enter, to save the mother who had never once been kind to her, and had come out of it crippled. "Why?" he said. It came out of him almost angry. "She has never, my mother has not been." He could not finish it. Even now he could not say the true word about his own mother in his own house. "No," Clemency said quietly. "She has not." "Then why?" And here was the thing she had learned in 3 cold years, the thing her ledgers had taught her better than any sermon. "Because worth isn't a thing you feel toward a person, Your Grace," she said. "It's a thing you decide. She is your mother, and this is her home, and she was going to burn alive in it, while people who called themselves her family watched from the grass. I decided that was not going to happen, that's all. There was no love in it." She looked down at her ruined hands. "Though I find I might have wished there were. It would have hurt less to do it for love." Aldous stood in the middle of the room he had married her to save, and something in his face came apart very slowly, the way ice comes apart on a river, a crack, and then a shift, and then the whole surface changed, because he had begun, standing there, to add up the other columns. 3 years of a woman he had crossed a room to avoid, who had been keeping his accounts, feeding his tenants, holding his crumbling house together with her trade hands, while he rode out each day to his flooded pits and told himself he was the one bearing the weight of it all. 3 years he had let his mother and his cousin do to her what they liked, and never once looked to see the marks it left, because looking would have meant admitting there was someone there to be marked. "I have not been," he began, and this time it was he who could not finish. "No," said Clemency gently, and with a mercy that cost her something. "You have not." She did not say more. She let the silence do it. And the Duke of Ravenscar, who had never in his life been made to sit inside a silence he had earned, sat inside this one and did not leave, and began, too late, but truly, to learn the worth of the thing he had owned for 3 years and never once troubled himself to see. It was a beginning. It was only a beginning. She was too much her father's daughter to mistake a beginning for a payment. Rosamond Vane understood, before anyone else in the house, that the fire had changed the arithmetic, and not in her favor. She had spent 3 years making the merchant's girl invisible. Now the merchant's girl was the only thing the servants would talk of, a heroine in linen gloves. And the dowager, Rosamond's dowager, her anchor, her one certain ally, had gone strange and quiet, and would not meet Rosamond's eye. Worse, Aldous had begun to sit of an evening in the small parlor, saying little, doing nothing, simply there, in the same room as his wife, as though he had discovered a door in a wall he'd walked past for years. So Rosamond did what frightened, clever people do. She reached for the story before the story could reach for her. She began, softly in the right ears, to lay a different account of the fire. Was it not strange, she wondered aloud to the dowager's woman, how the young Duchess alone had known the way out through the servants' stair? How she alone had been awake and dressed so quickly? A merchant's daughter, raised among warehouse men and their tricks with smoke and flame. One did wonder what such a woman might know about fires, and how they started, and how conveniently she came to be the one to end this one, a heroine. The Duke had been on the very edge of, well, everyone knew the marriage was cold. Everyone knew the £60,000. And now here was the merchant's girl, burned hands and all, made a saint in an afternoon, exactly when she had most need of the family's gratitude. It was cruel, and it was clever, and its cruelest cleverness was that it was almost believable. Because the true story, a poor cousin saved a shilling on a chimney, was the one thing Rosamond could never let be told. But Rosamond made one error, the error of people who have always managed the dowager. She assumed the old woman was still hers. She came to Honora's borrowed rooms with the whispers half sown, meaning to finish the work, meaning to remind her Grace that blood was blood, and trade was trade, and that the family must close its ranks now around its own. She found the dowager sitting very upright in the window light, and she began, in her lovely, reasonable voice, to explain how the young Duchess ought to be gently set aside before her strange behavior shamed them further. Rosamond. The old woman's voice was quiet and dreadful. Where were you? Your Grace? On the night of the Yao fire. Honora turned her head, and her eyes were terrible. You were in the courtyard, I have asked. You stood on the grass in your gray shawl, and you looked at the wing where I was sleeping, and you did nothing. And she, the one you would have me cast out, she came up my burning stair on her 2 feet and carried me down it in her arms. The dowager lifted one thin hand and set it, very deliberately, against her own breast. I have wronged that girl every day for 3 years, and she paid me back my whole life in one night. And you come to me now, with your soft voice, and ask me to help you throw her in the road. Rosamond's lovely face did a thing Clemency, had she seen it, would have pitied. "Aunt," she began. She had never called her aunt before. She had never dared. "You don't understand. The chimney, I only meant to save—" She stopped. But it was too late. The word had escaped her. The chimney, and the dowager Duchess of Ravenscar, who had ruled that house for 40 years and missed nothing, went very, very still. "What?" said Honora in a voice like the sea in winter. "Do you know about my chimney?" They tried to send her away. It was Aldous' attorney who did it, of course, a smooth Newcastle man named Ferris, who had come up to Ravenscar to look into the ruin, the insurance, the cost of rebuilding, and who found, to his professional dismay, a household in open war. The dowager would not speak to Miss Vane. Miss Vane wept in her rooms. The Duke would not leave his wife's parlor. And under it all lay a truth that had begun to surface like a drowned thing. That a chimney had been let go on purpose to save a shilling. And that the whole of the East Wing and very nearly the old Duchess's life had been the price of it. But Rosamond had not survived 20 years as a poor relation without learning where the true power in that house lay. And so, in her fear, she made her last and worst sum. If the merchant's girl were gone, cast off, sent home, the marriage set aside, then who at Ravenscar could point a finger at a chimney and a shilling? The Duchess was a stranger, low-born, strange in her ways. The servants would follow the family story if the family gave them one. Remove Clemency, and the whole ugly reckoning went out the door with her. And Rosamond might yet be what she had always meant to be. She had only to persuade Aldous that his cold, crippled, embarrassing wife had served her purpose, and could now be quietly, decently, honorably let go. To her horror, for one long day, it seemed she might. For Aldous was drowning in figures. The East Wing must be rebuilt, or the whole house would rot down around them. The colliery pumps were failing. A new engine would cost more than he had. The mortgage stood where it had always stood. And here was Ferris the attorney, murmuring that the settlement money, the £60,000 that kept the roof on, was tied so tight that his grace could not spend a shilling of the capital to rebuild, not one, not to save his own house from the sky. Land rich, cash poor, and now a third of the land in ashes. If only, Ferris murmured, the settlement might be unwound. If only the marriage were somehow at an end. The capital would fall free, and Ravenscar could rise from its ashes, and Clemency heard it all from the passage, the household keys cold in her scarred hand. She had known this table was coming. Her father had known it 3 years before either of these men sat down at it. Had all but drawn it for her. The room, the papers, the smooth gray attorney, the word delicate. She had always imagined that when the moment came, she would fight it. That she would go in with the deed box under her arm and wield it like a blade and make them keep her. She stood in the cold passage and found she wanted no such thing. She was tired in a way sleep would not reach. 3 years she had carried this house on her hands, and then carried its mistress out of the fire and come out of it marked for life. And now, in the next room, the men who owned her were totting up whether she was worth the cost of the keeping. She discovered she had no wish to stand outside a door and wait to hear the verdict pronounced on her own worth. She had spent 3 years waiting to be seen. She would not spend the end of it waiting to be judged. She would give the verdict herself. She went up to her room. She knelt at her trunk with her ruined hands and lifted out the black japanned box, and she called for Tabitha, and she said in a voice quite steady, "Bring the traveling trunk down from the loft." It took her the better part of an hour to write to the trustees, her stiff right hand laboring each large, slow letter, ink ghosting the side of her finger the way it always had. She told them plainly that she was leaving the Duke of Ravenscar, of her own will, and invoking the clause her father had written. His voice went with her over every word. Do not sit in a burning house, because you are ashamed to be seen leaving it. He had built her a door, and when she was too young and too hopeful to believe she would ever need one, she had only to walk through it. She was sealing the letter when Aldous came. He never came to her room. He stopped in the doorway like a man who had walked into the wrong house. He looked at the trunk. He looked at the black box open on the bed, the settlement out of its red tape, the letter under her hand. She watched him understand it in pieces. "What is this?" he said. "The one thing Mr. Ferris forgot to read before he gave you his advice." She did not rise. "My father was an underwriter, Your Grace. He did not hand a stranger £60,000 on the strength of an old name. Every farthing is tied in trust for my separate use, and the deed says that if I am ever cast off or set aside, the money goes home to Newcastle with me, and this house keeps none of it." She pressed the fold flat with the heel of her stiff hand. "Your attorney believed the marriage was the lock. It was never the lock. It was only ever the door. And I am opening it myself, so that you need not trouble your conscience or his delicate fee." For a long moment he said nothing at all. She had wanted once to have the Duke of Ravenscar look at her as though she were the only fact in the room. He was looking at her that way now. It had come 3 years too late to warm her. "You are leaving," he said. "I am saving you a hard winter. Rebuild your house on your own ancient name, and no man will ever again be able to say the Duke of Ravenscar married trade." She rose, the sealed letter in her hand. "It is what you have wanted since the day I came." "Clemency." It was the first time in 3 years he had spoken her name. "Do not." She said it quietly, and it stopped him where a shout would not have. "I know every word you might reach for, and I have an answer to all of them but one. If you ask me to stay for the roof, for the coal, for the £60,000, for the east wing, I will be past the gates before it is light, and we will both be the better for it. I have been kept for my money 3 years. I find I would sooner be wanted for nothing on this earth than kept for that again." She let him see that it cost her. "So, is there another word in you, or only the one you married me for?" And the Duke of Ravenscar, who had crossed rooms his whole life to avoid this woman, stood in her doorway with the thing he needed to say locked somewhere he had never once learned the way into, and could not find it in time. "That," said Clemency softly, "is what I thought." She walked past him with her father's letter, to leave it with the groom who would ride at first light, and left him standing alone in the cold room with the open box and the whole of what it held. She meant to be gone by first light. She was not. Word of a trunk brought down from the loft runs through a great house faster than fire. By the time the gray came up out of the sea, the whole household knew the Duchess was leaving, And they gathered, not summoned, only drawn, the way people are drawn to the edge of a thing ending. In the cold, great hall, where Clemency stood in her traveling cloak with the japanned box in her arms and her father's open door at her back. And down the stair, on her 2 canes, came the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar. In her deepest black, her widow's jet at her throat, moving slower than the servants had ever seen her move and refusing every hand that reached to help. She did not go to her son. She crossed the whole cold length of the hall to the merchant's daughter in her traveling cloak and stopped and said, loud enough for the last footman at the back to hear, "You will not walk out of this house carrying its sin out the door with you. You have carried enough of what belongs to us." Then she turned to the household and did a thing no one at Ravenscar had ever seen her do. She reached across and took Clemency's bound and ruined hands into her own. "Everyone in this house will hear me say this once," the Dowager said, in her cold, clear voice that carried to the door, "so that no one need ever whisper it again. 3 years ago, my son married money to save this family, and I made that girl pay for it every hour of every day, because I could not forgive that we had fallen so low as to need her." Her voice did not soften, but her grip did not loosen. "And on the night the east wing burned, when I lay in my bed too old and too proud to save myself, and my own blood stood on the grass and let me burn, it was these hands. These hands I called trade hands. These hands I taught this house to sneer at, that came up through the fire and carried me out." She lifted Clemency's bandaged hands for the room to see. "I owe my life to the one soul under this roof I was cruel to. Let no one at Ravenscar ever again say the word trade as though it were beneath us. There is nothing beneath us. We are the ones who watched from the grass." The hall was silent, and into that silence the Dowager's eye went past Clemency, down the length of the hall, to the fair young woman standing white against the far wall. "Bring in the sweep," she said. For old Corbett was there. Clemency had sent for him the week the stones cooled, and had meant to carry what he told her away with her in silence, out of a pity Rosamond had not earned. But the Dowager had caught a single word weeks before, in her own borrowed room, and the Dowager forgot nothing. Corbett came forward, cap turning in his soot-black hands, and told it plain, the way frightened honest men do when a duchess asks, and no lie is left worth the telling. The stack in the east wing was rotten. He had said so. He had begged to have it taken down and rebuilt before another fire was lit beneath it. He had been refused and given a shilling for his silence, and told to sweep it and be done. "Refused by whom, Corbett?" said the Dowager. The old man did not want to say it. He looked at the flags of the floor. And then, because she waited, he lifted his eyes, and every eye in the hall followed his to where Rosamond Vane stood against the wall. She did not confess. She defended herself, which in that hall came to the same thing. "It was £20. The words tore out of her, high and cracking. £20 we did not have. And she felt the cold so. She had to have her fire. I was only trying to manage. Someone had to manage this house. Someone had to be of use to it." She heard her own voice fill the silence and stopped, and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, and understood, far too late, that she had just told the whole of Ravenscar in her own words, that a shilling saved on her order had burned the east wing and very nearly killed the one woman she had spent 20 years learning to please. No one accused her. There was no need. She had done it herself, aloud, before the only people whose good opinion she had ever owned. She looked round the hall for the faces that had always forgiven her, and found the dowager watching her with a terrible pity, and the Duke with none. But before Clemency could speak, Aldous did. He had stood apart since first light, gray and unsleeping. Now he crossed to Ferris, who hovered white at the edge of the reckoning, and he said, in a voice pitched for the whole hall to hear, the most expensive sentence of his life. "Draw up the papers to release the settlement, all of it. Every farthing of Fen money back to Fen trustees, today, free and clear." Ferris began to sputter of the roof, the coal, the ruin. Aldous cut him off at the knees. "I have heard the sum, Ferris. I have heard nothing else for 3 years. Let the east wing stand a ruin. Let the pit flood to the mouth and the coal go under the sea. I would sooner own the wreck of this house and have her know I did not keep her for the roof, than own the whole of it and watch her ride out that gate believing she was only a figure in your book." He turned to Clemency, and his voice came down to almost nothing. "You asked if there was another word in me. That is my word, not the roof. You, go if you must go, but go a free woman, with your father's fortune whole, and not one stone of my ruin bought with it." The hall did not breathe. Beyond the walls, the sea went on. Clemency looked at the man who for 3 years could not see her, offering now to pull his ancient house down to the ground sooner than be thought to have kept her for its sake. It undid nothing. It gave her back no cold year. But it was the one thing she had asked of him, and believed him unable to do. And he had done it in the open, before every soul he owned, with his pride held out in both his hands. She did not fall into his arms. She was her father's daughter still. "Put the papers away, Mr. Ferris," she said. "No one releases anything today." She set the japanned box down on the great hall table, slow, with her ruined hands. "I am not leaving this morning. That is the whole of what I will say this morning, but it is not nothing." She sent Tabitha out to the stable yard to take the sealed letter back from the groom before he could mount, and the household let out its held breath all at once, the way an old house settles after a hard frost. As for Rosamond, Clemency found her within the hour at the foot of the servants' stair, packing her own small trunk with shaking hands, and did the last hard kindness of that long morning. Go south, to your cousins, while you can go with your dignity in your own keeping, and not have it taken from you across a magistrate's table. I know to the penny what it costs to be the poor one in the rich house. I would not wish the other thing on you." She saw Rosamond pensioned out of her own separate income, not as a reward, but because she had decided, the way she decided all things, that even the woman who had nearly burned them all should not be turned into the road to starve. It was mercy handed down as a verdict. Rosamond took it and went, and never came back, and lived a long, ordinary life, knowing exactly what she had thrown away, and exactly who had let her keep her pride. They rebuilt the East Wing. It took 3 years, nearly as long as the marriage had lasted in silence, and Clemency oversaw every stone of it, because there was no one else at Ravenscar who could read a mason's bill or an underwriter's policy or the plans for the new pumping engine that finally beat the water in the colliery. She could not hold a pen as she once had. The surgeon had told her true, and her right hand never fully closed again. So she learned to write a new way, slower, the letters larger, and she kept the accounts of the rebuilding of Ravenscar Hall in her own scarred, altered hand, and no one in that house ever again called those hands anything but the hands that saved them. The first thing she ensured, when the new wing was raised, was the wing itself. A proper policy with the Newcastle Fire Office, and a lead fire mark bolted to the stone above the door where every passing eye could read it. So that if flame ever came again, the insurance brigade would know the house was theirs to save. Her father would have laughed to see it. That bright new mark on an ancient ducal wall, trade hammered into the very front of Ravenscar for all the world to see. She had it fixed there on purpose. It was his monument, and hers. The Dowager lived 4 more winters, and spent them in the small parlor with Clemency and the account books. And if the two of them were never quite what one would call loving, they became, in the end, something rarer among such people. Honest. The old woman died with her scarred daughter-in-law's hand held in both of her own, and left her the jet mourning ring off her own finger, which was the only apology she knew how to make, and which Clemency understood perfectly, and wore. And Aldous. He did not win his wife back with a grand embrace in a fire-lit room. Clemency was her father's daughter. She did not sell herself twice, and she had learned the exact price of a thing a man had once been willing to weigh against a roof. He earned her back the slow way, the only way she would have it, and the whole of how he did it could be read in one small thing he took to doing every morning for the rest of their lives. Her right hand never closed. To the end of her days, she could not manage the row of little buttons at her own wrists. So each morning, the Duke of Ravenscar fastened them for her. He was clumsy at it for a long while. A big man's blunt fingers at a lady's maid's work, a task no duke in the 400-year history of the house had ever once stooped to. And he did it badly, and did it anyway. One small button after another, up the inside of each scarred wrist in the gray light before the fires were properly up. He never let Tabitha take it back. It was penance, and it was courtship, and it was the plainest sentence he owned. These are the hands that carried my mother out of the fire, and I will spend mine in their service every day I have left. And I do not care who sees me do it. Once, in the 2nd year of the rebuilding, a neighbor came calling too early. An earl of the old cold northern kind, all rank and no warmth, and was shown into the morning room to find the Duke of Ravenscar on one knee before his crippled, trade-born wife, doing up her cuffs like a servant. The Aldous of 4 years before would have died of the shame of it. This one finished the last button, unhurried, and rose, and met the Earl's lifted brow with a level eye. My wife's hands were burned saving my mother from the fire, he said. I count it the first honor of my house to fasten her sleeves. The Earl had come to smile at the merchant Duchess. He went home and told the story at 3 separate dinners, and could not, though he tried, make it come out as anything but what it was. The money they settled between them at the last, on her terms and no one's else. Keep your grand gesture, Your Grace, she told him, the week the trustees' papers might have been signed and the fortune handed back. I did not marry you to watch you burn this house down twice, once with fire and once with pride. My father's money stays exactly where he put it, mine held for me, and lent to Ravenscar because I choose to lend it, not because you own it, and not because you kept me. There is the whole of the difference, and I will have it written into the very walls. And it was. The East Wing rose again on fen money given freely by a woman who could have walked out the gate with every farthing of it, and every mason on the scaffold knew whose choice had raised the stone. And still he was not done paying, because the debt was not the kind that a sum could clear. Years into the new wings rising, on an ordinary morning, he found the truer thing at last. Not, "I'm sorry," which was far too small a coin, but the sentence his whole changed life now stood upon. "My father," he said, watching her write in her slow new hand by the beeswax light, "spent his life not seeing the worth of what he had, until the night he'd lost it. I told myself I was nothing like him." He looked at her scarred fingers moving across the page. "I was exactly like him. I only had the luck he didn't. I learned it on the night it burned, and you were still here in the morning." Clemency set down her pen. Outside, the sea went on against the rocks the way it always had, the way it always would, indifferent to dukes. "My father used to say," she told him, "that a man only learns the worth of what he owns on the night it burns." She held up her right hand, the scarred one, and turned it slowly in the candlelight. And for the first time in all the years he had known her, she smiled at him without a single guard behind it. He was an insurer. He believed you could put a price on nearly anything. The fire in the grate lit the old jet ring on her finger. "But he told me there were a few things you couldn't. He said you'd know them by this, that they were the ones you'd walk into a fire for without stopping to count the cost." She picked up her pen again in her altered hand and went back to the accounts of the house she had saved and rebuilt and made, at long last, her own. And the Duke of Ravenscar sat beside her in the warm, small room, in no hurry to be anywhere else in the world. And finally, 3 years too late, and just in time, understood exactly what he was worth to her, and exactly what it had cost her, and exactly how close he had come to never knowing at all. The end.